Night settles over northern Poland. A freight train slows on a frozen stretch of track between Warsaw and Lublin, its steel wheels screaming against the cold rails. Seconds later, the darkness flashes white. Metal twists. Power dies. In that instant, Europe's quiet assumption that borders are firm, that diplomacy still cushions conflict, evaporates. What looks like a single act of sabotage becomes something far larger, the opening move in a confrontation where bridges, consulates, and corridors matter more than tanks. Was this merely an attack on a railway line, or the moment Europe's last physical link to Russia began to disappear? Polish investigators would soon argue it was no accident. The line carried ammunition and humanitarian aid bound for Ukraine, a logistical artery of the war. Within days, Polish security services announced that technical data debris analysis and intercepted signals pointed east toward Moscow. The accusation was stark. This was not criminal vandalism, but state-directed sabotage. According to the file provided by the user, Warsaw interpreted the incident as part of a wider hybrid campaign, one designed to probe NATO's resolve and intimidate Poland into hesitation. The response was swift and unexpected. Instead of retaliating in kind, Poland chose a different weapon access. On December 23, 2025, the Polish government ordered the closure of Russia's consulate in Gdansk, the last remaining Russian diplomatic outpost outside Warsaw. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a strategic amputation. For years, intelligence analysts had described the Gdansk consulate as a listening post overlooking the Baltic, monitoring NATO naval traffic logistics flows and military exercises. When its doors were shut, Russia did not just lose an office, it lost eyes and ears on NATO's northern flank. The shockwaves spread quickly. Russia refused to vacate the building, at first turning a bureaucratic order into a standoff that underscored how much was at stake. When the closure was enforced, Moscow's official presence in Poland shrank to a single heavily guarded embassy in Warsaw. In diplomatic terms, this was unprecedented between neighboring European states not formally at war. In strategic terms, it signaled something more chilling. Poland was no longer willing to separate espionage from diplomacy. This move reframed the entire confrontation between Poland and Russia. What Moscow had intended as a low-level deniable operation instead triggered a response that cut far deeper. Small businesses dependent on cross-border trade found themselves stranded. Truck drivers waited for days at narrowing border crossings. Families with ties on both sides discovered that visas had become impossible to obtain overnight. The human costs accumulated quietly, even as headlines focused on geopolitics. Yet the most profound consequence was strategic. By closing Gdansk and earlier consulates in Poznan and Krakow, Poland dismantled what analysts believe was a carefully built Russian intelligence network inside the country. Years of investment vanished with a single administrative decision. For Moscow, rebuilding such networks would take time it no longer had. For Warsaw, the message was clear. Hybrid warfare would be answered not with fear, but with isolation. This was the first crack in a much larger structure. The railway explosion was not just an attack on steel and sleepers, it was the spark that began collapsing the last bridges between Russia and Europe. And once bridges start falling, what comes next? Deterrence, escalation, or something far more irreversible? The retaliation did not arrive with sirens or air raids. It arrived with document seals and police escorts. Warsaw's counterstrike unfolded quietly, methodically, dismantling Russia's operational reach without firing a single shot. In modern conflict, power is often exercised not through force, but through denial, and Poland understood this better than most. Within hours of the Gdansk closure, Polish authorities accelerated a broader diplomatic purge already underway. Consulates in Poznan and Krakow, long suspected by Western intelligence of doubling as intelligence hubs, were formally shuttered. According to security officials cited in international reporting, these buildings had functioned as collection points for signals intelligence monitoring troop movements, rail shipments, and NATO exercises across Western Poland. Vehicles protected by diplomatic immunity had allegedly traced supply routes flowing east toward Ukraine. When those doors closed, Russia's shadow infrastructure collapsed with them. This was not improvisation, it was doctrine. Polish leaders framed the decision as a response to state terrorism conducted on their territory, elevating the legal justification for extreme countermeasures. In doing so, Warsaw created a precedent that resonated far beyond its borders. If sabotage could be attributed to state policy, then diplomacy itself could be reclassified as a security threat. That distinction, once unthinkable in Europe, was now official. Moscow responded with ritual symmetry, announcing the closure of Poland's consulate in Irkutsk days later. On paper, it looked like a classic tit-for-tat. In reality, the exchange was asymmetrical. Russia lost a strategic vantage point overlooking NATO's Baltic logistics. Poland lost a symbolic presence deep in Siberia, a place of historical memory rather than military relevance. The imbalance was telling. It revealed how narrow Moscow's options had become. The implications went further. By erasing Russia's diplomatic footprint across most of its territory, Poland effectively blinded its adversary in peacetime conditions. Intelligence officers expelled under diplomatic cover cannot be replaced quickly. Networks cultivated over years do not regenerate overnight. For Moscow, this meant operating in the dark along one of NATO's most critical corridors. The message did not go unnoticed. Across the Baltic region, governments watched closely. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia began coordinating responses, aligning border controls, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic postures. The principle was simple, one for all. Any pressure on one state would be treated as pressure on all. This synchronization transformed Poland's unilateral move into a regional signal. For NATO, the shift was strategic. Hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation had long thrived in legal gray zones. Poland's response collapsed that ambiguity. By redefining espionage as an act of aggression, Warsaw forced a recalculation across Europe. The eastern flank was no longer merely defending territory. It was defending systems, railways, ports, data flows that sustained the alliance's credibility. Meanwhile, the human consequences deepened. Russian and Belarusian logistics firms saw contracts canceled. Drivers slept in their cabs at closed crossings. Families discovered that temporary restrictions had no timeline for reversal. These were not collateral effects. They were part of the pressure. Modern sanctions do not announce themselves with explosions. They suffocate gradually. What emerged was a new kind of escalation ladder, one built on access rather than firepower. Poland had demonstrated that in a connected world, closing doors can be more devastating than opening fire. And as the diplomatic map of Eastern Europe thinned, a more dangerous question began to surface. If Russia could no longer see, move, or negotiate as before, how would it react when cornered? The map now tells a different story. For decades, Russian military planners stared at a narrow strip of land between Poland and Lithuania and called it opportunity. The Suwałki corridor, just over 60 kilometers wide, was once labeled NATO's most vulnerable seam, a place Moscow believed it could sever to isolate the Baltic states. In late 2025, that assumption collapsed. The corridor did not tighten around NATO, it tightened around Russia. At the center of this reversal sits Kaliningrad, Russia's heavily militarized exclave wedged between NATO members. Once a forward bastion projecting power into the Baltic, it has become a logistical riddle with no easy solution. Poland's diplomatic closures and border restrictions changed the physics of supply. Rail transit through Poland slowed to a crawl. Road crossings narrowed. The message was unmistakable: access would no longer be routine. Then came the quiet alignment. Lithuania synchronized controls. Latvia and Estonia followed suit. With Sweden and Finland inside NATO, the Baltic Sea itself shifted from contested space to monitored expanse radars, layered patrols, constant exercises routine. Sea lanes that once promised relief now carried risk. Air corridors tightened under surveillance. What remained on land was the corridor itself. Suwałki corridor no longer NATO's weak point, but a chokehold. The strategic consequences are stark. Kaliningrad houses advanced air defenses, missile units, and a significant naval presence. But none of that matters without fuel, food, spare parts, and rotation for personnel. If rail and road transit through Belarus and Poland are curtailed further, and Warsaw's latest moves strongly signal that intent the exclave's dependence on sea and air resupply becomes absolute. In a Baltic now dominated by NATO sensors, that dependence is a liability. This is not siege warfare in the classical sense. No artillery rings the perimeter, no blockade is declared. Instead, costs accumulate. Sea lift multiplies expenses. Airlift strains capacity. Delays ripple through maintenance schedules and readiness cycles. For a state already stretching its economy to sustain a grinding war in Ukraine, the math grows unforgiving. Poland understands this calculus. By treating geography as leverage, Warsaw has weaponized patience. The strategy is not to provoke a clash, but to immobilize raising the price of every Russian decision until choices narrow. Stop the aggression or watch a critical military outpost drift towards strategic irrelevance. For Moscow, the psychological impact may be as severe as the material one. Kaliningrad was meant to be a symbol of reach, a reminder that Russia remained embedded in Europe's heart. Now it looks increasingly like a hostage to the very geography that once empowered it. The exclave cannot escalate its way out of isolation. Any attempt to force the corridor would trigger a NATO response far beyond the region. The transformation is complete. The corridor Russia once planned to close against others has closed against itself, and in that inversion lies the danger. When long-held assumptions about strength and access collapse, miscalculation becomes more likely. If Kaliningrad is no longer a sword, but a burden, how far would the Kremlin go to prove otherwise? What is unfolding along Poland's borders is not an anomaly. It is part of a wider pattern reshaping modern conflict where supply chains, access, and legitimacy matter more than battlefield momentum. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East and across the Pacific, power is increasingly measured by who can move and who can be stopped. Ukraine offers the clearest parallel. Since 2022, Russia's battlefield advantages have repeatedly been blunted not by decisive defeats, but by pressure on logistics, ammunition shortages, disrupted fuel depots, and strained repair cycles. Western support focused less on dramatic offensives and more on sustaining Ukraine's ability to endure. The lesson was simple. Wars are no longer won only by seizing territory, but by controlling the arteries that keep armies alive. A similar logic defines the shadow confrontation between Israel and Iran. Their escalation often takes the form of covert strikes on infrastructure, cyber operations, and disruptions to shipping lanes rather than open warfare. Each side probes limits without crossing thresholds that would trigger full-scale conflict. The battlefield is deniable, legalistic, and psychological, much like the hybrid pressure now playing out in Poland. Across the globe, the United States and China are locked in a comparable struggle. Tariffs, export controls, and restrictions on critical technologies have become strategic weapons. Semiconductor supply chains, rare earths, and maritime choke points now occupy the same strategic space once held by armored divisions. Under President Donald Trump, Washington has leaned heavily into this logic, framing access to markets and infrastructure as instruments of national power rather than neutral conduits of trade. Poland's actions fit squarely within this emerging doctrine. Instead of meeting Russian provocation with symmetrical force, Warsaw is exploiting asymmetry, law, geography, and alliance cohesion. By tightening transit and shuttering diplomatic nodes, it has shifted the contest onto terrain where Russia is weaker and escalation is harder to justify. Every delayed shipment, every rerouted train becomes a strategic data point. The ripple effects extend beyond Russia and NATO. China's Belt and Road Initiative relies on predictable corridors linking Asia to Europe. Poland sits astride one of the most critical of these routes. As security risks rise and diplomatic representation shrinks, insurers hesitate, investors pause, and alternative corridors gain appeal. The consequence is subtle, but profound influence migrates away from unstable routes toward safer ones, reshaping economic geography over time. In all these theaters, the same tension emerges. States seek security by restricting access, yet global systems depend on openness to function. The more borders harden, the more fragile interconnected economies become. Poland's strategy highlights this dilemma. It strengthens deterrence and alliance unity, but it also accelerates fragmentation in a world built on flows. For Washington and its allies, this convergence carries a warning. Hybrid tools are effective precisely because they operate below the threshold of war, but as more actors adopt them, the space for misinterpretation shrinks. A closed consulate here, a blocked rail line there, each move is defensible in isolation. Together they form a pressure system that can push rivals toward desperate choices. The question now is not whether this model works. It clearly does. The question is how far it can be pushed before the line between pressure and provocation disappears, and whether global powers are prepared for what follows when access itself becomes the battlefield. Behind the maps and communiques, the consequences of this confrontation are measured in hours, paychecks, and broken routines. Along Poland's eastern borders, lines of trucks stretch into the winter haze, engines idling as drivers wait for clearance that may never come. For them, geopolitics is not abstract. It is the slow drain of fuel, the spoilage of cargo, the phone call home explaining another missed payday. Small businesses feel the pressure first. Polish exporters who once relied on predictable transit routes into eastern markets face canceled contracts. Russian and Belarusian firms that depended on European components discover that alternative paths are longer, riskier, and more expensive. Each delay compounds inflationary pressure already straining household budgets. What sanctions could not achieve through paperwork alone, logistics now enforced through friction. Families are caught in a quieter crisis. Poles with relatives in Russia and Russians with ties in Poland find themselves separated by more than distance. With consulates closed and visa channels frozen, routine travel becomes impossible. Legal support evaporates. Births, funerals, and care for aging parents are postponed indefinitely. These human stories rarely make headlines, yet they define the lived reality of strategic isolation. The pressure spills into Belarus as well. Transit fees that once filled state coffers shrink as crossings narrow. Truck queues become symbols of a deeper vulnerability, an economy dependent on acting as a bridge in a world where bridges are being dismantled. As shortages ripple through supply chains, public frustration grows quietly, eroding confidence in governments that promise stability through alignment with Moscow. Even Kaliningrad feels the strain beyond its military installations. Civilian life in the enclave depends on the same supply lines as its bases. Food prices fluctuate. Consumer goods arrive irregularly. Residents sense the uncertainty of living in a place increasingly discussed not as a city but as a liability. Strategic chessboards rarely account for such details, yet they shape public mood in ways leaders cannot ignore. This is the paradox of modern pressure campaigns. They aim to avoid bloodshed by targeting systems, but systems are sustained by people. Each tightened border, each closed office extracts a toll from individuals with no voice in strategic planning. Over time, that toll accumulates into resentment directed outward, inward, or both. For Poland, this human dimension is not incidental. It is part of the calculation. By demonstrating resolve at home and solidarity with allies, Warsaw reinforces a narrative of collective security, but it also assumes responsibility for the social costs that follow. Managing public patience becomes as important as managing borders. The broader lesson is unsettling. In an interconnected world, economic strangulation can rival military force in its impact on daily life. It may spare cities from destruction, but it redraws lives just as decisively. As the pressure tightens, a final question emerges from the border crossings and empty offices. How much strain can societies endure before the demand for relief outweighs the will to resist? Power today is measured less by how far armies can advance than by how completely access can be denied. Poland's strategy has exposed that reality with unsettling clarity. By closing doors instead of opening fire, Warsaw has forced a reckoning not just for Moscow, but for the entire security architecture of Europe. This is no longer a dispute about borders alone. It is a test of prestige, credibility, and control. For Russia, the implications are severe. Isolation was supposed to be a tool used against weaker states, not a condition imposed on a nuclear power. The gradual suffocation of transit routes, intelligence access, and diplomatic channels undermines Moscow's image as a decisive actor. Prestige erodes quietly long before it collapses dramatically. When leaders can no longer guarantee movement of goods, people, or influence the narrative of strength begins to fracture. For the United States watching from across the Atlantic under President Donald Trump's administration, the crisis reinforces a central lesson of 21st century power alliances amplify leverage. Poland's actions only work because they are nested within a broader NATO framework. Without that backing, border closures would invite retaliation. With it, they become deterrents. The Eastern Flank's unity sends a message that America's strategic credibility still rests not only on military might, but on collective resolve. Yet this model carries risk. When access becomes a weapon, escalation paths narrow. A misread signal, a desperate gamble, or a domestic crisis could turn pressure into confrontation. Hybrid warfare thrives on ambiguity, but ambiguity cuts both ways. The more systems are strained, the less margin remains for error. There is also a moral dimension. Security achieved through isolation challenges the values Europe claims to defend. Freedom of movement, economic exchange, and human connection are sacrificed in the name of deterrence. The balance between safety and openness grows harder to sustain. Each closed gate raises the same uncomfortable question: at what point does defending freedom begin to resemble its restriction? For Poland, the answer is shaped by history. For Russia, by ambition. For the wider world, by precedent. What is happening along the Suwałki corridor and the Baltic coast will be studied far beyond Europe as a case study in how modern power is exercised without open war. The story does not end with a treaty or a withdrawal. It ends with a choice. Can great powers adapt to a world where geography and logistics decide outcomes more than force? Or will the pressure of isolation push one actor too far too fast? And for viewers watching this unfold, the final question is unavoidable in an age where bridges can vanish overnight. What kind of security is truly sustainable, and what price are societies willing to pay to preserve it? This crisis marks a turning point in modern geopolitics. What began as a covert act of sabotage on a Polish railway escalated into a strategic confrontation that severed Russia's remaining physical and diplomatic links to Europe. Poland's response, closing consulates, tightening borders, and coordinating with allies, demonstrated a new form of power built on denial rather than destruction. The result has been the isolation of Kaliningrad, the inversion of the Suwałki corridor's strategic meaning, and a profound shift in the balance of leverage along NATO's eastern flank. Globally, the pattern is familiar. From Ukraine to the Middle East and the US-China rivalry, access to supply lines and infrastructure now define strength. Yet this strategy carries human costs, stranded workers, divided families, economic strain, and growing uncertainty for entire regions. It also raises deeper questions about the balance between security and freedom in an interconnected world. As borders harden and access becomes a weapon, the risk of miscalculation grows. The pressure on Russia is real, but so is the danger of escalation. The unfolding situation forces a broader reckoning whether great powers can manage competition without sliding into confrontation, and whether societies will accept isolation as the new price of security.